Good afternoon. Thanks everybody for being here. I'm Liz McGill. I'm the Dean of the Stanford Law School, and I'm just delighted to welcome you to this conversation about James Forman Jr.'s new book, Locking Up Our Own: Crime and Punishment in Black America. I want to start by thanking Debbie Muckamal, who is here somewhere. Where are you, Debbie? There she is, of course, in the back doing lots of work, and Rick Banks for their hard work and their effort to put this panel together for our fabulous colleague, James Forman. I also want to thank the Department of History, the Stanford Center for Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity, the McCoy Family Center for Ethics and Society for co-sponsoring this event today. And many, many thanks to our panelists for accepting our invitation to travel to the Bay Area to talk about this book. Ron Davis, the former police chief of East Palo Alto and former director of the Office of Community-Oriented Policing Services of the U.S. Department of Justice. Professor Elizabeth Hinton, from the History and African American Studies Department of Harvard University, and Professor Donna Murch, professor of history at Rutgers University. We're just delighted that you're all here today. So I met James Forman in 1996 or 1997. It was at a house party on Capitol Hill. At the time, James was a public defender, and he was starting or just starting to think about starting the Maya Angelou Public Charter School with Dave Domenici. I stood in the kitchen with James and a small group of people talking about something very intensely. We were having this intense conversation about, I'm not exactly sure what. What I was sure of, though, that evening was that I was in the presence of someone who had already done great things and was going to go on and do great things. He was an incredibly deep thinker. He was enormously passionate about the topics of interest to him. He had done and he would do things that mattered, and those things were going to make a difference in the lives of others. In fact, I think it's fair to say that since that time, I have been trying to get James to join whatever institution I've been a part of. When I was at UVA, my colleague Jim Ryan and I spent some time trying to convince James to come to Charlottesville. Now my colleagues and I are trying to convince James to join us here at Stanford in the great state of California. What do you say, James? We at Stanford have been incredibly privileged to have James with us this year. We're especially honored to provide a venue to discuss his important new book. Now, I'm not an expert, but I have read the book. I do think that James has done something in this book that very few people are able to do. He has offered a significant intervention into one of the most important policy debates of our time. He has made a not at all obvious argument, and he has done so with meticulous and powerful evidence that has been beautifully intertwined with his own experiences in the criminal justice system. He said something important, something that was not obvious before he said it, and that seems to me correct. And there are lots of other reviewers who say that. That's more than a hat trick, a home run, or a trifecta, although it is all of those things. It's more important than that. I think it's a work that's going to shape what is said on this topic in the future. So tonight, I know many of you have read the reviews, this masterful account, and many other great statements about the contribution James is making in this book, but tonight, we're going to have the pleasure of hearing many more insights from James and our panelists as they discuss this book. So I'm now going to turn the conversation over to Professor Rick Banks and Professor James Forman Jr. and our distinguished panel to continue discussing the issues in this great book. Thanks for being here.
So I'm Rick Banks, and I am pleased to be here. I'm even more pleased. My mic is not on. They said the mic was on just a minute ago. Is the mic on?
The green light on?
Oh, the green light is not on. That's probably it. So otherwise, I was going to have to call my 13-year-old son, who takes care of technological challenges for us. But I'm pleased to be here, and I'm even more pleased to have all of you here. I'm especially pleased to have you here, and with such a great panel. This is a rare event, and this is a rare book. I won't belabor the virtues of the book, except to say that it is engaging, it is provocative, and it is timely. For those who are academics in the audience, this book seems to be at the sweet spot of what I believe academic work should be. This is an issue that's socially important, that's one element. This is an issue about which the writer is passionate and is deeply engaged in. And this is an issue that is intellectually meaty and substantive. You might think that those three can come together frequently, but in fact they don't. This is the rare book that can speak both to academics and just regular people out in the world, that can change ideas and shift paradigms in ways that can actually make the world a better place. So that's the last good thing I'll say about the book, because we want this to be a critical, really, we want this to be a critical conversation, and that means between us, when we bring the panelists on, and also we'll have questions for the audience, right? And we want to engage in the best sense of that term. So to put us all on the same page, I'll begin with a few questions for James, just to bring those of you who haven't read the book into the circle. So first of all, James, what brought you to the project? What was your motivation in undertaking it?
Great. Thank you, and I promise I will answer that question. I just want to thank a couple of people before I do. So I want to thank Debbie Muckamal and Bob Weisberg and David Sklansky for helping to put this event together. I want to thank Liz for that incredibly generous introduction and for your leadership at UVA and here at Stanford. Rick, I want to thank you for agreeing. You were my kind of dream moderator, and you agreed to do this, and I've been a fan of your work for many years, and so I appreciate you doing this. And I really want to thank the panelists. You'll get to see them in a few minutes, and we're holding them off stage, but you're going to see them in all of their glory and their brilliance in a few minutes. But it isn't often that you get an opportunity to have people whose work you have read carefully and followed and admired for many years come in a conversation about something that you are working on, and really a joint conversation, something that we all are working on. And so when I gave, I said to Debbie and to David when we were planning this, they said, well, who should we try to have? And I said, well, let's just start with the dream team. Let's just start with my ideal participants. They may not be able to come. Two of them I thought were across the country. Turns out only one of them is, but still. And so I said, okay, can we get Donna Murch? Can we get Elizabeth Hinton? Can we get Ron Davis? And they all said yes. And so this is, thank you. I really, really appreciate each of you coming to do this. So in terms of my motivation, I really had two motivations. One of them has nothing to do with the criminal justice system. And that motivation is, I don't know if any of y'all are like this, but I am. I'm the kind of person who, when I go to a movie, and when the movie's over, somebody says, so what did you think about the movie? If there were no black characters in the movie, my first reaction is always where were the black characters? And I'm kind of annoying that way. And I feel that way not just about film, but also about books, and also about art and literature and history and law. So I knew I always wanted to write a book that had African American characters front and central in the narrative. That was number one. The other reason, the other motivation, was more of a criminal justice-oriented motivation. So I became a public defender in the mid-1990s. There's a lot of stories in this book. There's argument, there's history. And one of the stories involves one of the cases that I had as a public defender. I opened the book with a young man named Brandon. He's a teenager, had pled guilty to possession of a gun and possession of marijuana. And I was his lawyer. And I had taken the job because I viewed mass incarceration as the civil rights struggle of my generation. We didn't have the term mass incarceration in the 1990s, but we knew that 1 in 3 young black men was under criminal justice supervision. We didn't have as good data about black women, but everything that we had suggested that there were extraordinary disparities there as well. We knew that the United States had just passed South Africa and Russia to become the world's largest jailer. And my parents had met in the original civil rights movement. They had met in SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, where my dad was the executive secretary, my mom was on staff. And so I'm coming to this work out of that civil rights background and wanting to make a contribution to the civil rights struggle of my day. Now I'm defending Brandon, and I'm asking that he be sent home. I have letters from teachers, from counselors, saying he's a good kid, give him a second chance. His mother and his grandmother are there in court. They want to take him home. The prosecutor in the case, African American, as was Brandon, as were almost all of my clients, the prosecutor in the case is asking for him to be locked up and to go to Oak Hill, which is a DC juvenile facility, which is basically a dungeon. No functioning school, no job training, violence, drugs rampant. The judge who has to make the decision is now looking out at the courtroom. He's got African-American lawyers arguing dueling positions. There's a young African-American boy in front of him, young man in front of him. And he, the judge, is also African-American. He looks hard at Brandon, and he says, son, Mr. Forman has been telling me that you deserve a second chance, that you've had a hard life. Well, let me tell you about hard. Let me tell you about Jim Crow. Let me tell you about segregation. See, the judge had grown up in that era, and he told what it was like. And then he says, son, people marched and fought and died for you to be free. Dr. King died for you to be free. And he didn't die for you to be running and gunning and thugging and carrying on and embarrassing your community and embarrassing your family. No, he did not. That was not his dream. So I hope Mr. Forman is right. I hope you turn it around. But right now, actions have consequences. And your consequence is Oak Hill. He locked him up. And ever since that day, I thought about the fact that the judge wasn't alone. The city council that passed the laws, it was a majority African-American city council. The police force was a majority black. The police chief was African-American. And it became clear to me, to put it mildly, that not everybody agreed with me and my colleagues in the Public Defender Service on all matters of crime and punishment. But beyond that, it became clear to me that there was a story that needed to be written. Hopefully, my goal was to do it with empathy and nuance and complexity, recognizing the pressure that people were under and the limited options that they had. But there was a story that needed to be written of how an enfranchised African-American community, the number of black elected officials increased 800% after the decline of formal Jim Crow nationwide. How an enfranchised African-American community came to go along with the same tough on crime agenda that the nation was pursuing. And so that was the book, that I wanted to write.
So now you've raised a question which we need to start to begin to answer, which is how this is a major intervention. I don't know of another study that focuses on an African-American community in connection with these issues. So what did you find? What's the answer to that question? How did the African-American community happen to go along with what we now understand to be a great social tragedy?
So I think we should stop right now, and everybody should go out and buy a book. I'll sign a book, and you can read it quietly. I hope you do. I will be signing books afterwards. I hope you will consider that. But you came here for the highlights. So the highlights of the argument.
This is like the trailer.
Yeah, exactly.
It's the trailer.
So the first thing that we have to understand is rising crime and violence and addiction. So the homicide rate in DC tripled in the 1960s. It doubled nationally. Heroin, some people in this room will remember crack. A few people in the room will remember that heroin was the crack before there was crack. Tore through black communities nationwide. In DC, in the early 1960s, they tested everybody who entered the DC jail for heroin and other drugs. 3% of the people tested positive for heroin. In 1968, it was 45%. Now, that's an epidemic. And it's not just the numbers, right, the rising violence and the addiction, but it's also the fear and the anger that it generated. So one of the things that I did was look through letters that constituents wrote to city council members. City council members that have retired have turned their papers over to various libraries around DC. And when you look at those letters, the pain and the anguish leaps off the pages. People write and they say, you know, I don't recognize my community. I feel like a prisoner in my own home. I feel like a stranger on my streets. I can't go outside because of the drug dealers. Do something, help me. Now, the second argument has to do with who is receiving these letters. So who's getting this material, these pleas for intervention and for help? It's the first generation of African-American elected officials, police officers, judges, prosecutors as well, to come into power in the 1970s. These folks remembered, many of them were from the South, many of them were from the Civil Rights Movement. They remember the history of underprotection in black communities. They remember when you didn't call the police in a black neighborhood if there was a robbery or if there was a fight, because they weren't going to come, bless you, they weren't going to come, and if they did, they were going to make matters worse. They remember when it wasn't murder, when there was a dead black person, it was just a dead black person, and sheriffs didn't use the word black person. So they remember this history. They're bound and determined to protect this community, which has never received adequate protection. Now, you might say, but why with police and prosecutors and prisons? And this gets to the next big part of my argument. This is a book about African-American actors, right? I said I wanted to write a book about African-American characters. But any book that is telling the story of African-American actors also has to be a book about the constraints that they were operating under, the limitations on their authority. So let me talk about a few of them. The first constraint is the history of racism and white supremacy and deindustrialization that has meant that the communities that they're responsible for protecting have been underinvested in, don't have good schools, are segregated, don't have adequate public transportation. And then here's the other thing. The other big constraint is these are local officials. They don't control the State House, and they don't control Congress. Elizabeth Hinton has written brilliantly and beautifully about the role of federal legislation over these years. The people that I'm writing about, they don't control those levers of power. So they have what I say, they had an all-of-the-above strategy. They wanted more police, they wanted more prosecutors, sometimes they even wanted more prisons. But they also wanted more jobs, they wanted better schools, they wanted an end to racism, they wanted people to fight segregation, they wanted mental health treatment, they wanted job programs, they wanted parks that weren't littered with syringes. They didn't have the ability to get all of those things because of the constraints that they were operating under. So they got, instead of all of the above, they got one of the above, which was law enforcement.
Okay, so we're going to go deeper into all of these issues, but to try to end this segment at least on a high point, and we'll come back to this issue as well, where do we go from here? What's the way forward? How do we get out of the mess we're in?
So most of the book, to be candid, most of the book is about the problem that has been the history, the story of how we got here. But along the way, and especially in the last chapter, I talk about things that we need to do to respond. So let me answer that question in sort of maybe an overarching way and then some concrete specific ways. So the overarching way is, the main argument of the book, or one of the main arguments of the book, is that there was never an up or down vote on mass incarceration. There was never a moment where we as a nation, and certainly not black communities, got to decide, hey, do we want to be the world's largest jailer? And if that had been put on a ballot, certainly in black America, the answer certainly would have been no. The way this system was built was by over a 40 or 50 year period, by a series of actors, police officers, prosecutors, judges, probation, parole, the private sector as well. Everybody becoming more punitive. And if everyone becomes 10, 15, 20% more punitive, and if we do it across 50 states and DC and the federal government and 3,000 counties, and we do it for 40 or 50 years, then what we get is mass incarceration. So now, I believe that the only way to unwind it is the way we created it. And that is to say, for everybody in all aspects of the system, and then I'm going to talk about average citizens, everyday citizens as well, but for everybody in all aspects of the system to become 10, 15, 20, 25% less punitive. Now, for people in the, we can talk a little bit maybe in the sort of next session about particular kind of policy reforms that might advance this. But I want to, for the kind of broader audience and in this opening comment, I want to focus on things that are even outside of the criminal justice system. Because I often get asked by people that aren't lawyers, that aren't in the system, they say, what can I do? Like somebody asked, I was in Cleveland at an event last week, somebody said,
Yay for Cleveland.
Yeah. What can I do? And I said, well, are you employed by a company? Yes, mid to high levels. I said, well, what's your company's policy on hiring people that have a criminal conviction? I don't know. So it makes me think of the Ford Foundation does this amazing work on criminal justice reform around the world. And they were doing a presentation with their head, Darren Walker, visionary leader, doing a presentation at a prison in New York. And they presented all their work. And when it was all done, one of the guys who was locked up raised his hand and he said, that's amazing work you're doing. I just have one question. When I get out, can I get hired at the Ford Foundation? Now, they couldn't answer the question because they didn't know, because almost nobody knows what their university's policies are or what their employers' policies are. I'll get to universities in 1 second. But to the Ford Foundation's credit, they went back, they scrubbed their policies, they got rid of as many of the exclusions as they could. And they went further than that. They started an internship program to hire people to bring them in, because one of the biggest challenges is just getting a foot in the door, right? To bring them into the foundation, paid internships, with the idea that if folks perform well, then they can get hired in a full-time. So it's a pathway to full-time employment. That's just employers, right? But universities, there's a huge disparity from university to university in terms of the policy. Some people, right up front, third question on the application, have you ever been convicted of anything? Have you ever been arrested of anything? Sends a message to people that if I answer that yes, they're not even going to read my application. Versus others that do it much later in the process as part of a holistic review. So then they know not just that fact about you, but they know a lot of other facts about you. And they don't dissuade people from applying because of that conviction or that arrest. So what's your university's policy, right? One other example just that I'll give on this. I've been going around for the last couple years and talking in lots of audiences, churches, police departments, universities about, what we can do. And I started thinking in my own work and my own teaching about asking that question of myself. What was I doing the same thing that I was asking other people to do? I've been teaching this class on race and punishment for a number of years. And then last year, I decided, took a lot of work, but I finally got approved to teach it in a prison, in a Connecticut prison. So I taught the seminar that I used to teach in the law school, I taught in a prison. 10 students who were incarcerated, 10 students from Yale. It was the most amazing experience, teaching experience, and I always tell other professors, anybody can do this. Your expertise doesn't have to be criminal justice. I got trained through the Inside Out program. Any field, you can go in and be trained to do this. And I tell other professors, don't do this for self-interested reasons, but it is true that my evaluations for that class were like off the charts. And those are the law students that fill out the traditional evaluation, but even more inspiring for me were the evaluations from the guys who were incarcerated. One of them wrote in his final evaluation, he said, I appreciated the law and the policy that I learned in this class. But really what meant the most to me was that for 2 hours each week, I sat around a room and people acted like I was smart and treated me like I was smart and I had important things to say. And that hasn't happened to me before in school. And another guy wrote, for 2 hours a week, I felt like I wasn't in prison. Now, none of these things that I'm talking about is going to buy themselves, and we'll talk about some reform. None of these things is going to buy themselves and 2.2 million people in prison, 7 million people under criminal justice supervision, and we don't even know how many people who have lost their right to vote, right? It's not going to end, but nothing by itself is going to end it. It's going to be, we all built it, either through active participation or through silence and complicity, and we're all going to have to dismantle it, and we all are going to have to start with our sphere of influence, the domain that we control, and ask, within that domain, what am I doing to dismantle mass incarceration? What am I doing to create a more humane justice system?
Okay, on that note, I'd like to invite the panelists up, and I'll say a little about each of you. So I guess we'll start with Ron Davis to my left, who I can only characterize as a repeat offender on issues of criminal justice and Stanford, because Ron has been involved with Stanford and criminal justice issues for, I guess we're into the second decade of Ron's involvement. And he has not only been a great participant here, but has been a national leader heading the COPS office in DC, helping to move us beyond where we are to a better place. To my immediate left, we have Elizabeth Hinton, who joins us from Harvard University, where she's an assistant professor of history and of African and African American studies. She has a forthcoming book, From the War on Poverty to the War on Crime, The Making of Mass Incarceration. It is out, okay.
It's out, and it's really
It is out,
good.
okay. I'm sorry. And so we recommend that. Harvard University Press. To my far right, we have Donna Murch, who's an associate professor of history at Rutgers. She has written widely about, and has a forthcoming book, or is that out as well? No, is that not out? It is forthcoming. Okay, so Donna does have a forthcoming book, Crack in Los Angeles, Policing the Crisis and the War on Drugs. So we see that James had another stroke of brilliance in assembling this panel, because these really are the best people anywhere to have comment on these issues. So thank you, all of you, for joining us. Okay, so excuse me. So what we'll do now is I'll just pitch out a few issues and tee them up, and then James can respond, and then one or more of you can take the issues as you see fit, and then after we have ample discussion here, we'll move to the audience. Okay, so one of the interventions you make in this book, James, is that you focus very little on the federal government, and focus mostly on what's happening really in Washington, D.C. You talk somewhat about other cities, but you talk very little about what's happening at the national level, even as the story is focused on D.C. That is a departure, I think, from where most of us start when we think about mass incarceration, the rise of mass incarceration. So what are the choices there in your decision to focus on the local story rather than the big national federal government story?
Yeah, so part of it is just honestly, there's really good stuff out there on the national story, right? Including Elizabeth's book. And so, right now, as an academic, part of the story is you write about what hasn't been written about. Part of it is the fact that I did want to focus on African American actors and there you need to look at cities because that's where the influence of black elected officials and law enforcement officials was greatest. And part of it is because I believe that is the most important place to look. So 88% of prisoners in this country are in state, local, and county prisons, not in the federal system. And it's true that the federal government has influence over state criminal justice policy. But I tend to think that we talk a lot about, everybody wants to talk first about Obama and Holder and what were they doing about mass incarceration, and now about Trump and Sessions and what were they doing. And I think that's hugely important. But 88% is 88%, and I wanted to talk about what was happening at state and local because I think that's mostly where the action is. It's also true that for law enforcement, so that's prison population, but for law enforcement, it's 85%. 85% of law enforcement is state, county, and local. So, I've long believed, the issues that I work on, school to prison pipeline. I go and talk to people about, the school to prison pipeline and zero tolerance policies. And I say, and I believe, that if you care about that issue, the most powerful, important thing you can do, and I'm sorry for my students from education, from my education class and my criminal justice class who are like rolling their eyes now because I've been beating them with this all quarter. But if you want to make a difference in that issue, get on the school board. It's the school board that decides whether to have zero tolerance policies or not. There's some exceptions. The federal government passes laws for, guns. But there's I represented kids in expulsion hearings. And we had a few cases that were mandated by federal law, but 90+% of our cases were under guidelines passed by the New Haven School Board that they had discretion over. So I'm a big believer in local power, in local politics, in lots of domains, including in the criminal justice system. So that's why I chose that focus.
Well, I'll jump in on this, in part because the book that I wrote is essentially a history of federal crime control policies. And as James said, I think one of the fantastic contributions is that now we have a really nuanced picture of the steps that it took at all levels of government, because the federal government does come into the story at times, that built mass incarceration, that it's something that happened incrementally, and that, as you say in the book, needs to be undone incrementally. So this really shows the process and the sets of decisions that got us to this point. I think that the federal government does play a really important role in terms of setting tone. So when Johnson and allocating resources to certain priorities, when we think about solutions, and a lot of the solutions, which I hope we get to, that James beautifully lays out in the book, are going to require a federal intervention. When it comes to the history of racism and kind of the expansion of citizenship for African Americans, it's always been, the federal government has been the primary driver of that in Civil War with emancipation and then with civil rights legislation. But at the same time, we get that legislation, we get a war on poverty as an attempt to really address issues of racial discrimination. We also get the declaration of a war on crime and commitment on the part of policymakers for the first time at the national level to begin to support local police forces. So I think what's exciting about the book is that this is the first narrative and comprehensive study about how the rise of these policies at a local level, and what it opens up with a number of other works out there is an opportunity for us to begin to synthesize these works to create an even larger picture about how we became the largest incarcerator in the world.
So I've had the ability to serve locally as a local police chief right down the road in East Palo Alto. Spent 20 years in Oakland Police. And then for the last 3.5 years in the Obama administration, working with law enforcement. And I agree with James that policing is local, but there is a role the federal government plays. And to understand it, you have to first understand what local looks like. So just for law enforcement, for example, there's 16,000 to 18,000. That number changes every year. 16,000 to 18,000 independent, individual, local, county, state, and tribal police agencies in the United States. that's a very unique, American policing system is very unique because most agencies and most countries have one or two national police. We chose because we wanted local control over police, so we have a system that brings policing down to the local level. But that means that 75% of those departments are 50 officers or fewer. It means that there is no national body right now or standards that the profession is held to account to, if that makes sense. And so like any other profession, and that's the question I posed when I was in DC, is law enforcement a vocation or a profession? A profession sticks to kind of a coherence to a national body of standards, best practices, evidence, and science, and we don't have that. So understanding how it works, you have these agencies that are now making decisions about crime policies in their community based on local factors, not necessarily the best practices of research. If you have a department of 40 cops, you don't have a planning division. You don't have researchers that's going to basically find the evidence or the science. You're going to go by gut, emotion, and response to the political moment of the day. That's where the federal government comes in. So, for example, when I was in D.C., the Obama administration focused heavy on research so we could understand what works, what doesn't work. Focused heavy on building trust and legitimacy. And what you do is you don't have authority over locals, but you can incentivize your grants and the money that you provide local to lead them in the right direction. And as a result of that, you can show that the most successful ways to engage a community is not mass incarceration. It's by building trust and legitimacy. It's by other conditions that create crime. So that's the socioeconomic conditions, the jobs, the education, everything that was talked about versus just saturating these streets with cops. And so this is very important. As I went through the book, it stood out because I enjoyed the history. It was unfortunately, I'm old enough to remember most of it. And so I look back into the 90s when I was a street cop working narcotics in Oakland to being a chief where you're trying to address issues of reentry. But more, what stood out for me wasn't so much the history as much as where we're heading tomorrow. And looking at the work that I was proud to be a part of with President Obama, to lead his task force, to identify some of the best practices. And right now, we're about to get tested on what that actually means, this idea of the federal intersection and local. In other words, you have now an administration that's making clear that they want to reverse the clock and go back to the issue of mass incarceration, increased sentencing. There's an article today where they're talking about removing some of the orders that Eric Holder, the Attorney General, gave with regards of sentencing and seeking maximums and charging and that kind of stacking up charges when you charge versus focusing on repeat offenders, violent offenders, things of that nature, which James eloquently outlines in the book. And so the question would be now, I'm very optimistic because policing is local, that the last decade has shown, the last 4 or 5 years through demonstrations and advocacy and activism has shown most police chiefs that the way to go is not going back in time. And so right now you're seeing my colleagues that are pushing back heavily on this administration, saying things like, we will not round up people and check their immigration status. That's not what we do. We refuse to do mass incarceration because the collateral damage is not worth the temporary suppression you'll get in crimes because now you're in a kind of an occupying force rather than contributing to solutions. And so, but my concern will be is the federal government can keep adding pressure. We can take $2-3 billion a year in grants and shape them to incentivize. The Obama administration was to incentivize trust, legitimacy, community policing. But they could easily shape that to incentivize incarceration, enforcement, tough on crime policies. But I think where it comes down to, and I think James alluded to this, that can only work if locals allow it to be so. And so when I was a police chief for 8 years, with all due respect to, even I enjoyed working for the administration, my guiding principle was not necessarily DC. It was my community. And if DC had a program that could help me and educate me and inform me to serve them better, then I'm taking a trip to DC and I'm applying for the grant. But if you're going off in left field and my community is going in a different direction, that will drive me because that's how I sustain success. That's how we have the strong relationship. And so local, it does mean a lot with local. And so you really have to get engaged to the point that you can make sure that local policies tells the police chief, I don't care what the Attorney General in DC is talking about, you don't check ID cards for immigration status in our community. I don't care what DC is talking about, it may be all money's not good money. You don't apply for any grant that will create stop and frisk or mass incarceration in the community. Now, it's interesting because you have to be very careful. I don't know if you covered this in your book, I'm looking forward to reading it, is one of the great programs that unintentionally created mass incarceration is the actual program that I had the honor of leading for 3.5 years. It came out of the crime control bill, the COPS office. with the idea of putting 100,000 more cops in the field. Now, the concept was community policing requires more resources for people to get out the cars, walk the neighborhoods, ride bikes, knock on doors, play with the kids, and therefore more cops. But if you just do an infusion of services and cops into a system that's built for enforcement, then all we did was make sure that the incarceration rate grew exponentially with the help of the federal government. So as programs are developed, we have to evaluate, we have to push back, and we have to also start thinking about its unintended consequences. To go back now, this is my greatest concern, when we know that it doesn't work. What they say, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing, expecting different results. I don't know what the definition of doing the same thing when you are expecting the same results. And that's the concern, is people are trying to do exactly what they did in the 1990s, not out of ignorance and not out of, I don't know any better. They know exactly what the result will be, which will be the containment of the African-American community, mass incarceration, which also has social implications for voting, jobs, and everything else. So we really need to pay attention where we're heading.
Okay, I want to get Professor Murch in the mix, and we have a whole slew of questions, but any general reactions, responses to the book?
Yes, well, this is absolutely a book with Black characters. One of the things that's so interesting about it is that it's a book about, I think, the punitive turn in the 1970s, really through today, but it's also a book about what happened after the Voting Rights Act. So the book focuses on Washington, D.C. I think I can reveal that. And the focus on D.C. post-Home Rule in 1973, it gives us a way to think about different Black political actors. And this is a story that's important to mass incarceration, but just more broadly, thinking about the creation of a Black political class. In many ways, Barack Obama is the fruit of the Black mayoralty regimes in the 1970s. And often that story has been told as a story really of the triumph of civil rights. This is what people fought for, citizenship rights. Not only to vote, but also to be voted for. So the 1970s is often a story of, Black urban regimes as a triumphal story of the beginning of real electoral incorporation. But James's book does many things. It allows us to think about the deeper roots of mass incarceration, and I really think that focus on it being piecemeal is very important. The idea that it was built over a 40-year period and that it was built to some extent, and Elizabeth has written about this so beautifully, the role of the federal government and the executive and policy in driving this, but also there are a number of moments in this book, which I won't reveal all of them, but of stories that we don't know specifically from DC about local referendums and initiatives around drugs, mandatory minimums, and gun violence. So there are a lot of stories here. If you're not from DC, they will be unfamiliar to you. There will be names of people. There were a few names that I knew, but there are a lot that I didn't know. And it's kind of a story of the creation of a Black political class. One of the things that we see in hindsight is that, and I lived through the 1980s and 1990s, and I was so struck by what James said about how we didn't have the term mass incarceration. That's absolutely true. It's amazing how we're reinterpreting these things that happened because so much of the focus was on quote unquote offenders themselves. The people themselves were the focus. In many ways, they were stripped of their personhood, and that's what we were focused on. We weren't focused on the policies and the practices that stripped people of their personhood. And so linking that to the story of the Black political class, I think is an important part of this book. One of the sets of questions that this book raises is how we understand an ideological spectrum within the Black community, as well as the interest between the civil rights movement was a struggle for justice, but it will also result in the creation of a new Black political class that is increasingly identified with the state. So I think that this book opens up a whole series of questions about how we understand the Black community, what that relationship is between Black electoral politicians and Black subjects, how that varies by class, and how people viewed law enforcement and gaining access to it as part of the civil rights movement, but its ultimate outcomes were, I think, very different than we would have predicted. The way we tell the story changes. Looking back at it since Trayvon Martin, since this almost 5 years of continual movement and protest and politicization, we look at these events very differently.
Okay, so I want to come back to this issue of the role of the federal government, since I'm in the middle, as it were, of the two sides here. What I'm wondering is, would mass incarceration have come about without the aid of the federal government from the 70s through the 90s? Or to put it differently, could the federal government have halted the rise of mass incarceration in our nation?
Can I start by saying there's two quick answers, yes and yes. I don't think it could have happened without the federal government. and I think the federal government was poised and is poised to stop it.
No, I'm saying at that time.
At
I mean,
that time,
this is
right.
looking backward. In other words, is this a story where what happened at the state and local level, the story that James recounts, does that story depend on federal government action,
think
or could it
that's-
have been halted by federal government
I
action?
think the answer is it depends on it, but at the same time, it could have been halted. And that exists, I guess I'm offering that with the story that it really, if you look at the national policies at the time, if you look at where the focus was, the Attorney General at the time, the passing of federal law with regards to mandatory minimums, just the priority, the comments from the president, I mean, everything from the war on drugs, it required heavily federal participation. But we also know had locals going to something that was, let's say the federal government had viewed to be unconstitutional and improper, it could have intervened, right? The way it's trying to intervene right now in various ways. So I think it could have played a role, it could have intervened.
So,
Please.
So I think one of the, and James touched on this in his opening remarks, is that African Americans, activists, are asking for all kinds of things, all kinds of responses to socioeconomic problems. They're asking for employment, job creation measures, and I'm thinking about kind of at the moment of the origins of the national intervention, which is in '65 during the Johnson administration. It's not, we often think, and this is part of what my research has shown, we think that kind of Nixon or Reagan really took the reins on this, and they're responsible. The federal intervention started at the height of progressive social change, and it was this moment when national policymakers, really for the first time since 100 years prior, during the Civil War, were interested in dealing with issues of racial discrimination. So people are asking for unemployment or jobs. People are asking for better public schools. People are asking not to live with rats and rodents in their, and working plumbing in housing projects. And instead, ultimately, what they get is more police officers, more incarceration, more surveillance. And James, the book in many ways is the story of this happening time and time again. I wrote an op-ed with James's colleague, Veshla Weaver, and a colleague of mine, Julie Kohler-Hausman, in the New York Times, and we called this selective hearing. And we wrote about the ways in which this selective hearing of African-American voices played out in the passage of the '94 crime bill, which is that African Americans tend to, they're speaking out against police brutality. They're speaking out about what James called the paradox of African American experience, which is being over-policed and under-protected by police forces. They want socioeconomic remedies to the problems that breed crime and social harm. But instead, policymakers hear more police. Instead of better policing, they hear more police, and that's what they get. So why? What is the kind of post-voting rights, post-civil rights story is that despite all of these socioeconomic demands coming out of African-American communities, what ends up getting implemented and picked up by all levels of government are these punitive responses to social problems. And I think the federal government had an opportunity where there could have been, in the Kerner Commission, I mean, one of James's, I think, really profound solutions is a Marshall Plan, essentially a Marshall Plan, an investment, a reallocation of resources in low-income communities. And this is something that the Kerner Commission, for instance, that people were talking about in the 1960s, and we never got that. Instead, we got, on the federal government's part, a massive infusion of resources into the expansion of American law enforcement and criminal justice. Instead of a real large job creation program as part of the war on poverty, job training programs were implemented. And the job creation program that really came out of that period was a job creation program for police officers, mostly white police officers, although DC is an exception, but mostly white police officers responsible for patrolling low-income Black and Latino neighborhoods. So I think the federal government is really critical in terms of shaping tones and directing interventions and resources and incentivizing incentivizing possibilities for local and state government.
I would also add to that, I also think the federal government is extremely important. It's always hard for us as historians because I think we're always trained against counterfactuals. So we're always trained to try to think about historical contingency, but always thinking about the ways that history did in fact unfold. But I think that all the things that Elizabeth said about kind of the infrastructure that the federal government created, the funding, how central that was to the funding of local police departments, the role of the executive also in having a kind of pulpit to make crime the central focus and having that, recurrent focus with each administration. I think also the naturalization of the rhetoric of the war on drugs. It becomes part of the core political culture. And I think that there are multiple actors in this. There's the federal government, but there's also the national media that picks up on the language of the war on drugs. So even in a local story, you find Black actors using some of the same language that's borrowed from the Nixon administration. So in that sense, I love this study for the richness of the story about really Black politics in DC and its relationship to it, but sometimes it's very hard to disentangle the federal from the local. And I think that, the government and elite media create a discourse, which in turn is adapted and used and influences some of the local actors. But I think that it's a mistake to think that it is only a top-down story. And what this book does is really bring us a whole group of people to think about their own individual role, the role of prosecutors, and how many Black people themselves saw this essentially as a way to protect the Black community. So the using of civil rights as the protection of Black lives and viewing crime as a threat to the collective community is one of the insights that comes through this book. And I think it gives us a way to think about how the federal and the local fit together, and then to disaggregate the role of Black actors in producing policy.
Okay, so one of the themes that's come up here, and one of the themes that I think we see a lot in this debate is between the poles of Black victimization on one hand, which is, I think, a dominant theme, right? The story is that the rise of mass incarceration is a story in which Blacks have been victimized and their interests have been sacrificed. But James, you don't deny the truth to that, but you also feature in your story what we might call Black agency. That people, community leaders in Washington, D.C., that they did have choices. They could have not pushed for harsher, more draconian measures, mandatory minimums, increasing of the maximums. People like Eric Holder figure pretty prominently in the story, who in fact, as a U.S. attorney in D.C., had the option of not engaging in the sort of harsh policing that we would decry now, but instead he was a staunch supporter of that. You talk about Maxine Waters in Los Angeles and her efforts along the same lines. How do we think about this dichotomy between Black victimization on the one hand, Black agency on the other? Who's to blame, if anyone?
Right. So I guess, I don't know, that provokes a few reactions. The first one I want to say is that when we talk about Black victimization, one thing that I feel like this book contributes to is there's this prevailing narrative that's deployed. I quote Rudy Giuliani, but there's so many people who say this, that say, well, Black people only care about crime in Black communities when it's police violence, but nobody ever speaks up against Black street crime or crime by Black people against other Black people. If you don't do anything else, for me, if you don't do anything else with this book, my only request is that the next time somebody tells you that, hand them the book or tell them about it, because it is a 239-page rebuttal to that lie. This is, there is nothing but concern by citizens, by elected officials, by police officers, by prosecutors, by judges. There is nothing but concern for Black lives. There's nothing but an understanding of violence done to Black people, unaddressed and unprotected and unremedied, as a civil rights issue. There is nothing but that in this book when you read these stories. So Giuliani just needs to stop lying about this. I'm not the first person to present the evidence, so I'm not overwhelmingly optimistic about his willingness to stop, but this is at least one more piece to put forward on that. Now, on the question of to me, the question of agency and constraints is the most daunting, challenging question of the book throughout, because I am constantly torn between moments where people have choices, right? The judge in the opening narrative, he could have sent Brandon home. He really could have. And we can talk until we're blue in the face about historical racism and the fact that we didn't get the Marshall Plan that we wanted, which I'm all about talking about. But he had a call to make. And he chose to lock my client up. And he has to own that choice. Now, he does. I mean, he doesn't think he did anything wrong, right? He was the Martin Luther King figure in his story, right? I came to court as the Martin Luther King figure in my mind, and he was like, no, I'm defending the civil rights movement and our legacy. So he doesn't think he did anything wrong, and he believes that he had agency. At the same time, right, and there's so many examples of that. Black citizens go to the polls in 1981 and vote on whether to have mandatory minimums in Washington, D.C., and they vote for them. And the arguments were made against. The civil rights community and the elected officials were opposed to mandatory minimums. But they passed. Okay. At the same time, right, it's also true, all these things that we've been talking about. It's also true, as we've now said multiple times, it isn't the only thing they wanted, right? It's also true they couldn't get Congress to listen to their pleas. It's also true that they were trapped in these communities because of a history of racism and redlining and segregation and a New Deal that left black people out of it and deindustrialization, right? All that's also true. So that's where I end up, right? I just end up in this place of trying to elevate what I see is this complexity. And I continue to wrestle with it. And I can't, for me, I can't deny either one.
So let me, go ahead.
That one point that you mentioned, I'm going to come from a police officer's perspective, because I would say over the last 4 years when I was in D.C., that was the number one argument I heard with this idea, is especially when you look at the demonstrations, whether it was from Ferguson to Baltimore, from Mike Brown to Eric Gardner, it's why black folk were not concerned about it when it's a 15-year-old is shot in gang violence. And I agree with James, that narrative is so false, but and I think you have to push back even harder than what James is suggesting. Okay. I told my colleagues, I would give it credence as a cop, as a chief, if you made it at 2 o'clock in the morning while we're looking at the 15-year-old victim of gun violence and start wondering, why was he out here to begin with? And that we need to basically come together to change all the conditions that allow to be there. But if only time you bring it up is when you get caught on videotape beating the hell out of somebody, right, then you're trying to deflect.
That's right.
You're trying to say that, don't worry about me beating you because you got a bigger enemy, which is yourself.
That's right.
And that's nonsense. And I would share with them that, like anybody, if you found out in your neighborhood that there was a predator in the neighborhood, you would come together, you would protect yourselves, you would educate your kids. If you found out your predator was a teacher, you would demonstrate and go you would respond differently because one is at the hand of the government. Government violence can never be confused with street violence. As I told my officers, is why are you comparing yourself to a gang member? A drive-by is not the same thing as a person with a badge violating their basic oath in the Constitution. So you got to push back heavy because that becomes the excuse for everything, for disparities and stops, for stop and frisk, and you really got to push it. And I think to the other part of who's to blame, I think what ends up happening in many communities, and I really enjoyed the book, and there's some things I didn't know. I didn't know at the time that an organization that I'm a life member of, Noble, was created in '76. James outlined as a result of crime and violence in the black community. But the group was there to push policies about advancing, diversity in policing, and one of the first things they did was support this tough on crime agenda. And so we really got to make sure we understand the consequences of everything that we're doing, but we also have to make sure that we're not making our communities, that even though blacks in certain cities were enfranchised, if all of the options that they outlined were taken away, then what you're saying is, you have all these problems. The only tool I'm going to give you to fix it is a hammer, and you know the phrase. If all you have is a hammer, then everything looks like a nail. And so for many communities, they've been convinced by many of us, by elected officials, by police, by everyone, that the only way to be safe is that you're going to have to give up just a little bit of those rights. And the first thing to do then is to create so much fear to make you afraid of the crime, to make you afraid of a young black man walking down the street, to make you so afraid that you will willingly give up that right. And we can see this happening today. Whether it is to make you afraid of the so-called boogeyman, whether that's an immigrant in their mind, or whether it's a young black man, that you're willing to then compromise your own values because you're convinced that's the only way to be safe. If you do nothing else with the book, I would say also hand that book to the person that there are so many solutions outside of that, that the best way to be unsafe is to keep engaging in the kind of policies that destroy the fabric of our neighborhoods. So I think the book, when I read it, it was interesting to me, besides feeling old, especially when you know some of these people, and you're going back into the 80s and 90s. I became a cop, part of a special program. It was for 14-year-olds, so that's why that's a side joke. But really, I started thinking about where we're at right now, and history absolutely repeats itself. So hopefully we'll get to the point of what are the lessons from that period of time. And I think the black community, to be very honest, not that there's one monolithic community, but black communities, I think, understand the impact of those decisions. They were unintended. I don't think people thought about it. We embraced policies, but it has caused so much damage to our communities that what I'm seeing right now, people are now pushing back. So we have to educate the entire nation to understand why the fear of crime and violence, even though we're sitting on 30, 40-year lows, is not sufficient to go back. It's not sufficient to give up rights. It is not sufficient to excuse us of other things. And last point, when you look at some of the policies, like you will hear your chiefs talk about hotspot policing or saturation of neighborhoods. I think to James's point is I believe in broken windows, which is going to cause controversy here.
We're going to get to that.
And I believe in hotspot policing, but I think a broken window means you fix it, you provide alternatives to the guy that broke it, you change the conditions on why the window was broke. If broken windows is a hotspot, it's simply cops stopping people and citing them. That is so counterproductive and ineffective. And so if you're going to have hotspots, you got to start demanding not just community policing, but community-based governance. So if there's a hotspot, then once you put jobs in there, recreations in there, education systems in there, and if you do that, you trust me, you only have to put a couple cops in there, because there would be so much other activity and growth that people will police themselves or can partner with the department and have the kind of the relationship that you're talking about.
Okay, so Ron, you referred a number of times there to the community, and we've all talked about the black community here. One of the interventions of the book, I think, and one of the salient claims that James makes is to recognize that the black community is not monolithic, and in particular, the issues of crime control, incarceration, policing, punishment policy. These policies all have quite a dramatic class skew. The people who are forming the policies are the black elite in Washington, D.C., the black middle class, the upper middle class, the judge who sentenced your client was a member of that group, and the people who bear the brunt of those policies are, by and large, the poor. And while those divisions between the black poor and the black elite are not as stark, perhaps as between black and white in D.C., there's socioeconomic residential segregation there as well. So to what extent is this a reframing of the usual focus where we think about white leaders sacrificing black people's interests for a variety of reasons, to a framing where we understand the problem as black leadership and black middle class people and upper middle class people sacrificing the interests of a black poor that they do not feel as much of a common bond with as we might imagine?
So I think the class story within Black America is incredibly important. So I want to say one thing about the sort of, monolith, the monolith, or to me that is one of the contributions, or one of the things that I really wanted to advance, was not just class differences, but also ideological, philosophical, right? Part of what I wanted to do was present the richness of a set of intellectual debates, a richness of a set of perspectives. And because so often to go back to my movies, if there is a black character in the movie,
He's usually going to die early.
Gonna die early, or it's one, and you gotta make sure that they don't have any love interest. It's like this one individual that's separate from the main universe of people, and so you get this flattened out perception of the black community. So I wanted to elevate all the debates and the richness and the argument, and to show that these disagreements are happening, and none of this is that surprising to black people who know that this is happening, because we all have it in our family, in the church, in the barbershop. I mean, everybody, I bet if you ask any black person about this book, all the characters that are represented in this book, they know somebody like that. They know the lock 'em up person, they know the set 'em free person, they know the root causes person, they know the minister that's like, I love you, but I gotta criminalize that behavior to keep you from doing it. They know everybody. Okay. There's one other thing I want to say. I'm about to talk about class, but I'm going to say this. Please understand that when I talk about class, I am not talking about this as an alternative to or a rebuttal of the story that focuses on race. I'll say that again. I'm about to talk about class, but I'm not offering that as a rebuttal of the story that focuses on race. Because I feel like every time I have this conversation, then I go out there and somebody comes into the hallway and says, I heard what you said about class, but don't you think racism is really important? Yes, I do. Absolutely. You cannot understand the history of this country. You cannot understand the history of mass incarceration. You cannot understand the demographics of this room right now in the audience. You can't understand any of that without thinking about racism all the time. Okay, now, I'm going to talk about class for a second. We do have tremendous divisions in the black community, as we do elsewhere. Like, the people in prison in this country are poor. The white people in prison are poor, the black people in prison are poor, and undereducated. Obviously, that's a generalization. I'm talking about, there's an exception to this, but I'm talking about 80, 90%. The lifetime risk of incarceration, if you are a black man who has dropped out of high school, is 10 times higher than the lifetime risk of incarceration for a black man who went to college. And I apologize for only using those numbers there for black men. That's where the data, and not also talking about black women, that particular data set is a data set that's based on black men. Every indication that I have based on my own experience says that if the similar data would hold for black women. So this has an impact on policymakers, because the people that are making policy are all from that group of people who is much less likely to be incarcerated. And that doesn't mean somebody doesn't have somebody in their family or know somebody or somebody in their church. I'm not denying that there is both kind of linked fate, kind of as a conceptual matter, and also in a relationship and family way. So I'm not saying that that black elected official from that upper middle class background is in the same position as a white elected official from that upper middle class background. I'm not saying that. But I am saying that they're in a different position than Brandon and the people that I was representing who were charged in criminal court. And you can see that in some of how the policy debate on this issue has evolved. What is the one exception, the biggest exception within criminal justice, to this idea that class and education matter so much? Don't answer, but just think about it. What is the one issue that first became a racial justice issue within the criminal justice system before anybody talked about mass incarceration? The answer is racial profiling to both. That is to say, when you are driving as a black person, it doesn't matter how many degrees you have, and it doesn't matter your wealth, you are susceptible to discriminatory treatment by the police just based on the color of your skin. Because the officer doesn't know your wealth or your educational background. And it's also true that that was the issue that first came to attention in the 1990s. Racial profiling was, before anybody talked about mass incarceration or before we had a big national conversation about it, it was an issue. And I think there's a connection between those two. That is to say, it was black elites who may have been able to protect themselves from the ravages of mass incarceration, but were not able to protect themselves from being racially profiled. If you go back and look at the first racial profiling stories in the 1990s, it was always the Skip Gates. That was more recent, but it was always that story. It was the black professional, it was the black athlete, it was the black person with means, it was often black police, even some black law enforcement officers. And then people said, aha, we have an issue. Now, and this is where I give my community a lot of credit, and I agree with Ron Davis on this, there has been an evolution. That is to say, now I'm talking to the students, your generation I think, has a much clearer-eyed view of this. Your generation is starting to see mass incarceration across the board as a racial justice issue. And I end the book with a story about the DC Council taking the same issue, marijuana decriminalization. In 1975, they voted not to decriminalize marijuana. Then in 2014, they voted to do it. They decriminalized. And what happened in that 40-year period is this conversation that Donna was talking about. What happened is what happened is Black Lives Matter. And what happened is the new Jim Crow. And what happened is Bryan Stevenson getting a national audience to talk about his book, Just Mercy. What happened is Ta-Nehisi Coates, right? What happened is so many people got a platform and so many activists started pushing this issue that black elected officials have started, I think, to have a much broader conception of mass incarceration as a racial justice issue. The incredible community pain that has been created has now been documented. And so there's a willingness to talk about this issue that really wasn't present 40 years ago for a lot of reasons, one of them being class.
That's what point people, if you get a chance to Google it, there's a group that I'm proud to be a member of called Law Enforcement Leaders to Reduce Crime and Incarceration. This is where my optimism comes from. It's about 200 of us that are police chiefs, former police chiefs, U.S. attorneys, prosecutors of some of from everything from former New York commissioners to chiefs of some of the most complicated and challenging communities in the country. And they sent a report to the new administration when hearing about the idea of tough on crime. And I think it goes to what James is saying. This generation, millennials understand it, but we need to take advantage of this. You're seeing a generation of police leaders that also get it. And this is an extremely diverse group that have outlined 5 ways to fight crime in our community, and it's all about relationships and building trust, and that we believe, and this is one of the proud moments that President Obama talked about in 2014, that not only did the crime rate go down, but the incarceration rate went down. We believe that you can accomplish both, that the arrest is just a tool, and it should be a very surgical and strategic tool, not a strategy. But to see prosecutors, and it's not widespread, 200 relative to the numbers we talked about, it's still small, but to see that there's this push suggests that there's this movement, and like any progress, it's not surprising then that now walls are being built up and people are trying to go back. But I think if we keep pushing, and if I just really focus on what James said, especially for the millennials, what I've witnessed over the last 4 years in DC, from young people and their activism, and how fast they were able to create a platform and reach the powers in D.C. to sit down with the Attorney General of the United States or the President of the United States to talk about policy was significant. I just hope that we keep moving forward and continue it, and even though it may not be the administration some would pick, and maybe some have, to each his own, it doesn't excuse our responsibility to continue pushing that agenda.
Okay, so I want to pick up on Ron's point. We typically, when we talk about mass incarceration, either in terms of the history and the development or in terms of remedies, we often assume a divide between drug crimes on one hand and violent crimes on the other. In the historical story, right, of how mass incarceration came about, we give prominence to the war on drugs, and we associate the rise of incarceration with the war on drugs. When we talk about reform, and President Obama has done this as well, and in a section of the book which James, and James recounts this in the book, President Obama has emphasized the importance of reforming penalties for drug dealers or drug users. Drug crimes, he thinks, we need to have reform, but violent crimes, there's no sympathy. So that's yet more evidence of this stark divide between drug crimes on one hand, violent crimes on the other. Part of the intervention of the book, I take it, is to actually collapse or complicate, or as some people would say, problematize that, which I hate saying that, but complicate that.
That word does not, problematize does not appear in the book.
Yes, it does not. It does not. This is a jargon-free story, but you do complicate that dichotomy. So thoughts on whether that dichotomy is useful or to what extent is it a hindrance, both in terms of how we understand mass incarceration and where do we go from here?
If I could start, if I just...
Hold on, we're going to start this into the panel.
Please.
This was, to me, one of the most powerful arguments in the book and so important. And it draws so much power from its direct intervention in contemporary debates. Also, we had this moment, right at the moment of the November election where we thought there was going to be this possibility. We were all at the starting line to really expand sentencing reform, to chip away and begin this process of the piecemeal dismantling, as well as trying to think about, prison abolition and radical forms of ending mass incarceration, and then the election turned out differently. But one of the biggest, I think, activist interventions in this book is to try to break down that distinction between nonviolent and violent crime. And the book shows historically about how the war on drugs was so integrally linked. A lot of the rationalization and justification of the war on drugs was the attribution of increase in violence in cities to drugs themselves and to users. So it was this, representations of users as monsters, which in turn was used to explain violence, that justified punitive drug sentencing policies, but also the development of mandatory minimums for gun possession and gun control. And one thing I really walked away strongly from this book was thinking about how gun control functioned in some ways as a war on guns. And it was a war on guns that overwhelmingly targeted populations. And one of these, young populations, poor people and poor people of color especially. And one of the things this book does is, and I think that in some ways this has become almost a taboo subject in, kind of certain areas of talking about mass incarceration, is to say that, violent offenders need to be focus of sentencing reform. That if we only focus on people with nonviolent drug convictions, that we're never going to chip away at the edifice of mass incarceration. And the so-called violent offender, this is at the center of what led to this vast increase in incarceration. And I think the book does that beautifully, and it gives a historical account of it, and it really wonderfully integrates James's activist work as a public defender with his work in schools. And it has the power of vesting it with individual stories of a young man who you will find in the close of the book, and telling it as it should be told, as someone's story versus an abstraction. Because the stripping away of people's individual lives, what they look like, what their relationship is with their mother, or their father, or their younger brothers and sisters, when we begin to use abstractions like violent offender. And I think the book reanimates and re-endows the empathy that's required to think about, well, how do we attack mass incarceration? One thing that we have to give up is the notion of a deserving nonviolent offender versus a forever condemned violent offender.
Could we just stop? Could we just quote that? That's like my new
That's a
blurb.
good one. That's a good one. We have it recorded. We'll do that later. We're going to do some interviews after the panel, too. We'll
Allow
get
me
some more
to
snippets.
push back just a little bit. So now I'm going to give you the law.
You can push back more than a little bit.
Yeah, law enforcement side of it. And when I got to that part of the book, I struggled, to be very candid. And I think a part of it might have been is I think probably to start would be what is a violent offender? And I think to assume we're all talking the same thing is probably dangerous. And that may be part of it. So in the book, I think the violent offender, one would argue, might have been, I think, a robbery near the end, James. And if you depending on what crime you identify as violent, may go to it. But after spending 30 years in the street, I think you're going to have a hard time to build a kind of support to reduce incarceration, because when some people think of violent crime, they're thinking of the less than 1/10 of 1% who probably should be in prison and probably should be there the rest of their lives, because they are murderers. There are people that will kill 2, 3, 4 people. I saw this as a police chief. And no matter what program you give them, no matter what reentry services you give them, as a human, that there are some people who are just evil and violent. And I think, unfortunately, I know you're not talking about that less than 100%. And violent crime, it becomes so broad that it really becomes a distinction that probably is not effective. But I just want to caution as we do this, is as we're trying to reduce incarceration, as we're trying to look at strategic, I think it's like anything else. It took 40 years to get here, James is saying, and I think the first step is to get people to realize that incarceration is not a strategy to fight crime. The first thing to get them to see them is that, the bail system is not effective. And getting people out of those jails, waiting for trial, is not going to cause crime to go up. Getting people to see that providing alternatives like Operation Ceasefire, not the one that James is talking about, but the ceasefire where you bring in gangs and people that you think are violence and provide them alternative and services and watch them choose a different route, that all of that can work without compromise to public safety or the community. Unfortunately, and I think this is the simplistic part of it, and I don't want to oversimplify it, if you just try to compare violent and nonviolent, people are going to go to something different. They're going to go to, as a cop, I'm immediately thinking of the guy that would actually at 2 o'clock in the afternoon drive down the street, put 50 rounds into a corner, and kill a 3-year-old. And you're going to lose me right there. Because if you're telling me that this person should not be in jail for 25 years, I disagree. I know you're not saying that. I just want to say as we have this debate and discussion, I think the first thing is we need to define what violent crime is. Second, when you're saying what does it mean to be tough on them, it doesn't mean that necessarily someone, depending on the circumstances, the level of violence, the intent, that there's still not alternatives. It doesn't mean that we don't build interventions to try to salvage people. I think everyone is salvageable. But I just think we lose the argument when you look at 75, 85% of the people in prison right now are for nonviolent crimes. Then to James's earlier point, we can reduce that in half just by getting people to accept that portion of it. And I think then people learn the lessons, as we did over the last 40 years, about the tough on crime policies. We can now understand the policies of being smart on crime and more efficient with our services. You're seeing for the first time that criminal justice reform is also bipartisan in D.C. You got the Coke industries that are supporting sentencing reform and criminal justice reform, probably for different reasons, because fiscally, $80 billion a year for incarceration is significant, $8 billion in the federal system. But I just want to offer that view. I got to speak to that view because I just cringe a little bit knowing that you don't mean it, but I'm thinking of that one person that people that live in the community know that person's, excuse the phrase, is a shooter. And how do you stop that person?
I think the gloves are about to come off. Okay, we're getting closer.
Well, I think that your response basically answered the question, because you said less than 1/10 of 1%. That's what you said was the population that you were talking about.
That's exactly right.
And that you said less than 1/10 of 1% of the population, and then you went off to tell these gruesome stories.
Right.
And that's exactly what happens in conversation about criminal justice reform, is somebody acknowledges, as you honestly did, that let me say this. If we're talking about less than 1/10 of 1% of the current prison population, then I'm good. Now, I want to have a separate conversation about how we treat people who are going to be locked up. So one of the reasons why I don't want to demonize anybody is that as soon as we start demonizing people, even the less than 1/10 of 1%, then as soon as we demonize them, we do a bunch of things. We wipe their history clean, so we stop understanding any of the context of what led them to that point. We stop understanding any of our larger responsibility as a society to create conditions so that the next person isn't created who will do that. And we stop having any conversation about what is our obligation to people who we are housing in prison. Right now, we have some of the world's most inhumane and destructive and damaging prisons. And so I don't want to dehumanize anybody, even the 0.1%, for all of those reasons. Having said that, if we're talking about 0.1%, then we should acknowledge that. The reason why I chose, it's so funny, people do this isn't the first time that this has happened where somebody says, well, you were talking about a robbery. Well, robbery is the most common, statistically, violent offense in our prison population. So I'm talking about the mainstream. I'm talking about the heartland. I'm not talking about the 0.1%. But what people do is they say, well, we can't talk about violent offenders because there was this dude who drove down the street and put 50 bullets into a 3-year-old. But what you're doing is you're talking about actually 50% of the prison population, which is in there for a violent offense, but you're using examples that actually apply to the 0.1%. So let's all agree that I'm not talking about probation for the guy who puts the 50 bullets in the 3-year-old. Although I am talking about treating that person very humanely while they're incarcerated. Now, let's talk about everybody else.
Well, let me ask you a question, though.
Oh,
If I just can, just to push back on that idea. I think we're saying the same thing, but it's...
You're not saying the same thing.
I think we are in the sense that...
You're not saying the
Let me
same
say this. I said, for example, the example you gave was robbery. And what I meant by redefining what is violent, I guess I'm offering that probably should not fit into that. If you just say violent, the average person in the community, the average person sitting in the audience, the average person watching the line are going to go to an extreme. It is a human behavior. I'm not making an academic argument. I'm making a human behavior why people reject the notion. You're talking about a mainstream, but I'm agreeing with you that robbery, if you look at what violent crime is, I'm not talking about robbery. But if I don't know any better, I think you are talking about the such a small percentage that you're really not talking about it.
Right, and so see, when you said, I don't know any better, I want you to know better. So that this book and this conversation is about getting people to know better.
I agree.
That is exactly what I'm trying to do. So when you say, well, if people don't know, but I'm saying let's have people know. So violent offenses, I think most people think of having somebody come up to them at a bus stop, armed with a knife, and taking money from them as a violent offense. That's the story that I tell in the book. That person is statutorily in all 50 states, that is defined as a violent offense.
Right.
It's designed, and I think it comports with our intuitions. What I'm saying is that if we're willing to move past categories and we're actually willing to look at individuals, so the person that Donna talked about is a young man who was guilty. He was guilty. He was arrested on the scene, knife in his pocket, proceeds of the robbery in his pocket, just steps away, really, from where the robbery took place. Nobody, Brian Stevenson could not have convinced a jury that this guy was not guilty. I know I couldn't. But what I did do, which was an unusual thing, we didn't do it often in my office, is I went and talked to the victim, the guy that he robbed, Mr. Thomas. And I told him about Dante's life. See, because here's the thing. The one thing that Mr. Thomas knew is the one thing that most people know when we say the label violent offender. The only thing he knew about Dante was that 6 seconds at the bus stop. Of course, how else would he know anything else? Well, I talked to him about Dante's family, about his mother who was addicted to drugs, who had not been able to provide for him, who basically left him and his brother to raise himself. I also told him about how Dante really cared for his younger brother, who was this amazing carpenter, woodworker. He had created all these sort of artistic things, including his brother's name carved out of wood. And I told him about how I had found a program for him run by a pastor out of a small church, after almost every other program in the city had turned me down, because as soon as they heard it was a robbery and it was a violent offense, they said, no, we don't take those. We don't take violent offenses. But one guy had taken him in. And I told Mr. Thomas that he had apologized, Dante had apologized to the police on the night of the robbery, which was true, and I had his confession there. And I gave all of this to Mr. Thomas, and I said, so here's the thing. I think Dante has a chance to really turn his life around through this program, but the judge, who was, by the way, the same judge who had locked Brandon up, he's probably not going to go for it anyway, but he definitely wasn't going to go for it unless the victim was on board. And this victim, understand, was the exact kind of person that DC's black political class had mobilized tough on crime policies on behalf of. He was an African-American laborer, the exact kind of person whose robbery the criminal justice system never would have even considered in the 1940s, 1950s under Jim Crow. And they had enacted all these tough on crime laws to protect him. Mr. Thomas told me he would think about it. Couldn't decide. And a few weeks later, I saw him in court. And he was sitting in the hallway, and I went up to him, and he pulled some crumpled papers out of his pocket. He had the confession that Dante had signed, which I had given him, and he had an apology letter that Dante had written. And he said, I've been thinking about your request that I forgive your client. And he said, I can't do that. He said, but I am trying. And I can go along with that program. He went into court, the prosecutor pissed, the judge shocked. But caught him on judge on a good day. And he put Dante into that program. And there's a little end to the story, which I'll save for the book. But my point is a happy end. My point is, that's a violent offender. But it's also a person with a history and a context and possibilities for redemption. And what I want our criminal justice system as a system to not follow these labels, but to do what Mr. Thomas did.
You look, Rick, you look over here.
No, I'm not. I think we're good. So
I still believe, Rick, that we're saying the same thing, but I would just say, if you're talking about making social change and making the argument, do not lose the war by winning the battle. And what I'm saying is the story you have, and I read it, I love the ending, is when you saw him some years later. I don't think we're saying, and if you talk to a lot of people that are going to influence these decisions, like police officers and law enforcement, it's a compelling story. You can win them. But the categories, whether they should be there or not, it exists. And if people leave here and start talking about changing sentencing on violent offenders without the caveat, without the education, without the information, you will lose the war. The battle is just like anything else. You said it took 40 years. We have to start winning some victories. 10 yards at a time, first down at the first down until you get the touchdown. You can't keep throwing these bombs. And I think your story, I think you'll find that there is an entire profession that's willing to support that. Because, in other words, you're right, robbery is violent crime, but I think when people, just the human behavior, people are not thinking like that until you bring them that way. So as we make the argument, I guess I'm not countering you as much as I'm trying to qualify as people make the argument that it's not as simplistic as the argument appears on its face, that it will be offered as being that someone's trying to reduce the sentence of a violent offender, because that phrase is going to make you go to the worst thought in your mind, especially if you're a victim. If you go into trying to give people a case-by-case, second chances, looking at the entire person. Now, we're not even talking about the humanity of prison. You can win the battle and the war, because I think this is where you want to get away from the mandatory minimums and put some discretion. Even that can be somewhat dangerous, but put discretion back into judges to actually factor all of that. So I guess I'm saying the same thing, but I just bet the 35 years as a cop and in this field, you will, in other words, the resistance you're going to get if you just generically state that is going to be massive.
Okay, so Ron, you're teeing up another question, which I will offer in a minute. Okay, well, let me let
Make a
people.
quick response?
Yeah, but let me just let people know that if you have questions, we have a mic here in the center, or we have two mics in the center. So if people could go to the mic, and then we'll start to take questions in a few more minutes. Please, I'm
Just a
sorry.
very quick response. I do think it's important to have uncomfortable conversations. The sentencing reform that's supported by the Koch brothers is not targeting the core of mass incarceration. One of the most powerful statistics in this book is if we simply release from jail every drug offender, it's only 20%. So the notion, and I think it's important to use the language that's recognizable by the public, and the public, including the Obama administration, address the distinction between the nonviolent and the violent offender. What we've seen in sentencing reform, Proposition 47 is an excellent example, is the focusing on nonviolent offenders. But the danger is that we don't want to look back 40 years later and see that we reinscribed and strengthened the exclusion of a population that was considered untouchable. And language is important, I think. So I think that's the bravery of the book. It's speaking to the part that's uncomfortable. And I think that if we really want to dismantle mass incarceration, we have to have conversations that make us uncomfortable. And I do think, there are different points of view in the Black community and in the larger United States about this. And I think it's a hard conversation, but I think it'll be very difficult to make progress unless we're willing to have the hard conversation.
Concur?
Okay, so one of the issues that James discusses in this book concerns the relation between the integration of law enforcement agencies, that is the influx of African Americans into the law enforcement agency, and how that relates to broader efforts to promote justice between law enforcement and the communities that they are bound to serve and protect. The conventional view was that those two goals would push in the same direction. Right, that as you brought more blacks into policing and into departments that previously had been all white, you would simultaneously further the goal of justice between the department and the community. And I think James doesn't problematize that, but he does complicate that story, or show that story is more complicated than we might think. And to overstate it, and Ron, I will pitch this toward you, to overstate it, we might say from the book that we are wrong if we think that bringing African Americans into decision-making positions and into line positions within police departments, we are wrong if we think that that's part of the solution, because there's no necessary connection between the racial representativeness of the department on one hand and the justice with which that department engages the community on the other.
I agree with James, the way he outlined it in the book. I think the research is showing that in order, especially let's say at the rank and file level, just started with the chiefs in DC, that the number would have to be a pretty significant number to actually change the culture of the organization. So just hiring a handful of minorities, whether they're African Americans, and even today, if you're even talking about women, the culture and the thing that we're debating about the system is so powerful that can that person stand up and use their diversity to change the system, or do they become indoctrinated and to become a part of the system themselves and being the strongest advocates? And that translates to, you hear minority communities, sometimes the black cops are worse than the white ones. And so I don't think it's the sole answer. I don't think it's the panacea that people offer it. I think the idea of looking into a department that does reflect gives you some idea, some hope that those views will be shared, that as I sit in a room, whether at the national level or a regional level, when I was in East Palo Alto at a county level, to be able to sit in a room with the county chief, so you don't need the black chief in there, then right then and there, it has a responsibility. If I live up to that responsibility, then there was a benefit for the fight for that diversity. If I don't push back, whether it's on profiling, whether it's on arrest, whether it is on the strategies of saturating my streets of East Palo Alto, whether it's pushing back for the same people that wear the same uniform, if I don't do that, then there's no benefit of why you fought for the diversity. And what happens is the field and policing will try things like all cops are blue, but you just happen to be black. And I used to tell my colleagues, one is I don't know how you happen to be black, but I'm actually black and I happen to be a cop. Now, I just retired as a cop, but I can't retire as a black man. And so what should happen is my diversity should be my strength, which means when I sit in a room, I have a responsibility that where I disagree is to speak on behalf of my experiences, but that is not necessarily always going to happen. The system push backs on it strongly. So if you know, and the book does it, there was that generation, and James outlined it beautifully, where we just thought that was the solution. The silver bullet was you got a black chief. Yeah, I think at one point you got 8 black new officers, and that's the end of the conversation. And I think it really isn't. Diversity, I don't think we pull away from diversity, but I'm gonna get in trouble for saying this one, so forgive me. If you really want to change the dynamic of a culture of a police department through diversity, gender, get more women in policing, and you will change the culture of policing in an extremely positive way. And then we're seeing that when you get more gender diversity, you get more compassion, you get more de-escalation, you get more negotiation, you get the kind of results that you're looking for. That was a little bit of bias part of my side, but I agree with James, how you outlined that in the book completely.
Yeah, gentlemen, one of my favorite moments in the book was when you were describing the ways in which the students at the Maya Angelou Charter School were policed, and the ways in which basically mostly black officers would stop and search them and brutalize them and harass them. And this was just kind of part of their everyday life as they tried to get an education. And one of the staff members at your school, because this is a site of black police officers beating on mostly black kids, that this was an example of, this is another example of black on black crime. And I think that speaks to, in some senses, the real limits of where the legacies of civil rights, which have really shown up in representation and not these kind of larger socioeconomic transformations that were very much a part of civil rights demands. And we're still kind of faced with many of the same problems. And it goes to one of James's larger points that I think is really important, in addition to what we've been talking about in terms of rethinking the way that we sentence and how we frame offenders, is that we need to rethink kind of the purpose and function of police officers in communities that are targeted for increased patrol. The act of harassing students in this way on an everyday basis doesn't make the students safer, and it doesn't make the police officers safer. And I think we're beginning to have these kinds of conversations, but the general approach to policing, and that's not, and you can have an all-black police force, but if you don't change the idea that the job of a police officer in a low-income community is to search for potential suspects and round them up, then we're going to continue to see these fundamental problems in American society and the erosion of our democracy and our constitutional rights, especially if you're living in a over-policed and underprotected neighborhood.
Okay, so on that note, I wanted to extend that and to talk a little bit about concrete policy reforms, and people have hinted at those, and James has hinted at those as well. But in particular, I want to talk about, in addition to that, I want to talk about what are the primary impediments to reform, right? If the problem were easy, it would have been solved already, right? So what is it that we need to do? What's standing in the way of bringing about those changes?
In terms of impediments, I think there are multiple impediments. One is finding alternate lenses, and this is where I think James's book is important. A lot of work that's been produced over the last 10 years in particular about trying to provide an alternate analysis from what justified punishment. So first, understanding what's happened. The thing that's been so powerful, I think, with the movement for Black Lives and the anti-state sanctioned violence movement, all the youth activism over the past 5 years, and Ferguson, to me, was very critical to this, as was Charlotte and Baltimore, because this was, particularly the Ferguson case I know well, these were poor people, for the most part, who were involved in the sustained protest in Ferguson. So in other words, you had a lot of people that had felony convictions, and I went to the Ferguson protest. They came out and they talked about having felony convictions, even just saying it out loud. Because there's an immense amount of shame. You know, part of the way that mass incarceration functioned was through shame, people's shame, and the use of shame. Even the lecture that the judge is giving in your book, to me, that is about endowing someone with the ultimate shame. Not only are you shameful as an individual, you're shameful because you are ruining the collective progress of the community. So it was really powerful to have people come out and say, you know what, I have a felony conviction, and I think it's wrong that Mike Brown was killed. So I'd say that's one thing. It's like alternate lenses are very important. Being very careful about punitive language that strips people of personhood. That is deeply ingrained in American society. It's part of our origins as a settler colony. So I think the language that we use and making sure that we don't make the few stand in for the many. I think this is a larger issue about the political economy incarceration. Many people focus on private prisons, but overwhelmingly the system of mass incarceration is state-based. However, we have seen in the last 20 years many kinds of ways that incarceration generates money. I think that's one of the greatest lessons that we learned from Ferguson. It wasn't unique to Ferguson, but there are multiple forms of revenue raising, particularly for municipalities. And the question of how to place that historically going all the way back to convict leasing. But I think that is another impediment, and it also speaks to some of the complicated interests that have come together to support reform. I don't think they're all the same. And I guess finally, linking it back to the question of policing, I think that this book invites us to have difficult conversations about our own community and to try to challenge ideas of punishment. And I think I myself have gone through a real process of consciousness raising through researching the war on drugs, researching mass incarceration, and changing some of my own thinking. So I think that more kind of forums like this where this idea, one of the important things about having Black characters is it allows people to see themselves reflected in the conversation. And I think that we have conversations in our own families about this, conversations with employers. So in addition to supporting policy change, I think trying to figure out how we continue that process of consciousness raising in order to find the solutions to fight this. Because I agree with James that fighting it at the local level is really important. And that's a way, we see all the students mobilizing on the campuses, people mobilizing in individual cities. I think that the local-based organization, just as he tells a local story of the history of mass incarceration, local-based organizing is very important to how to move forward and really push for, grassroots push to dismantle this system.
Please.
Can I jump in really quick?
Of course.
One of the things that I'm thinking about language and transformation, social transformation, James challenges us to approach issues like drug addiction as a public health concern. And I think this kind of shift, because it was a decision that was made to criminalize drug users. And now that with the opioid epidemic and conversations about meth have led to this kind of renewed focus on rehabilitation, and of course these are drugs that are disproportionately used by rural white Americans, and so we have this rehabilitation response versus the criminal response. But we need to begin to think about these issues in terms of health, and I think we could also add gun violence to that as well. What if we responded to issues of gun violence as a public health crisis, the kind of homicide rates? Like, I think there's a statistic in there that in DC in 1989, 9 out of 10 victims of homicide were Black men. Why did we not? That is a health. That seems to me to be a health issue. Drug addiction is a health issue, not a criminal one. So these are basic things that we could come together on to begin to incrementally undo the harms of these policies over the past half-century.
Can I point you to another great project with Andrew Papachristos at Yale, looking at social network analysis. If you look at most violence, it's very concentrated, very contained within a very social network. And if we treat violence like, I would say, a bloodborne pathogen, which it spreads through certain at-risk behavior, and you intervene, right? So that you try to find out about that social network and provide the services to disrupt it, so that one shooting doesn't turn into retaliatory shooting, and then the third and the fourth, and before you know it, you have a lot of shootings. And then in response to all those shootings, we then deploy 50 cops out there and take everybody to jail, and that's how it happens. And so I think there's been a significant push, to the professor's point, about looking at violence through the public health lens and responding to it. When I was in East Palo Alto, I always had a joke with our partner with San Mateo County Health System, with the epidemiologist, to start looking at it. We start seeing overlays of the concentration of crime was also the concentration of the most chronic disease rates. In other words, high blood pressure, diabetes, just the chronic disease rates were because it's poverty. There's no grocery stores at the time. There's a lot of things with that. And people are not going to go outside and play if they're ashamed of gun violence. But they're also not going to go outside and play if they're afraid of getting stopped every 5 seconds by the police. So we basically went in there and we opened up the parks. We sent cops in there on segways and shorts, playing in a park, riding bike, taking kids on bikes, because I believe that the greatest deterrent to crime is not a bunch of cops, it's a bunch of residents engaged in their own community actively and also building up health. So I think you're right. But politically, you even have, I think, until recently, I think the CDC was barred from doing research on gun violence. And so we need to find out some more answers, and I think if we follow the professor's recommendation, I think we can get there a lot better. And once we have that information, then we don't have to really focus on draconian practices that will result in a kind of the court cases that James dealt with, where you're thinking that by taking a guy with a drug crime that you're somehow stopping violence, when the likelihood is that young man was never going to pull the trigger ever in his or her life to begin with. And so I think that's going to be one of the big challenges.
Okay, we have some questions. Please.
So this is a wonderful and critical conversation. I'd like to thank all of our panelists, in particular Professor Forman, who I too hope will one day decide to call this marvelous place called the Bay Area home. All right. So my question is, are there examples, state level or even other nations, are there examples of dealing with severe crime problem without resorting so much to incarceration? And if there are, what approaches were taken there?
Well, yes, in the sense that, so if you look at kind of industrialized, like if you look at European countries, they don't have, mainly because there's not the same proliferation of guns, you don't have as much violence. That is to say, you don't have as many shootings, you definitely don't have as many homicides, you don't have as many armed robberies with guns. But you do have property crime, burglaries are just as high. And there, the approach has historically been, across the board, less punitive. And it's not because they're any less racist, right? All the public opinion shows that there's, racism is deeply entrenched throughout Europe. But part of the difference is that in places that have a more robust welfare state and more robust social policy, then the leap to a rehabilitative criminal justice policy doesn't seem as great. So we haven't talked about this so much in today's conversation, but we've talked about things like a Marshall Plan for Urban America and investments in thinking about this as a public health problem. But another way of thinking about the point is, whenever you have a conversation in this country about some aspect of criminal justice policy, and it's always informed by our impoverished social welfare state. So, for example, I told a story about education in prisons, right, my own teaching. If you tell people that we want to offer higher college education in prisons, they say, well, we don't have public college education in the community. I can't afford to go to college. Why should the prisoners go to college? In places that provide that more routinely, it doesn't seem as strange that we would provide it for people that we incarcerate. We do so little for the poor in this country generally that when we look at housing, people say, well, why is there a television? Why do they have room to roam? I can barely afford that in my own apartment. Healthcare, right? It comes up all the time. You'll see these stories, especially 20 years ago. There'd be somebody who would be getting treatment for their chronic condition in prison. How are they getting treatment? I don't have any health care. So I think that the places that have dealt with this less punitively have also been places that have had a more robust general welfare system. It's also true, just one other example, we've seen in the last decade, most recently California right now is in the middle of it, but New York for the last 10 years still has a prison population that's too large, and large by historical standards. but it's declined significantly in the past decade, declined 20%. And crime has continued to decline in New York State as the prison population. So we have Europe as a model, and we also have state-to-state variation in this country, where I think it's hard at this point to say that the only way to respond would be the punitive crime policies that a lot of states have followed. We just have too many counterexamples now available to us.
Okay. So I've been told we're short of time, but I hope we can get everyone in if we are,
Questions?
yeah, if we are concise.
All right. Thank you, Professor Forman and panel. I did not read your book. I just found out about this event recently, but I had to be here because you were doing something very brave and very frightening to take the lid off of the complexity of the Black community and these issues of complicity. And speaking of, language that we use to frame this, some language that I haven't heard and I was curious about, and wondering if you use this term in your book, restorative justice. And I know it from an education perspective and applying it, and also criminal justice. But do you address that term and what that could mean and how we create a community where everybody in it can support it and go along with it? Just in working in the public school district here, and you talk about, in the prison, school to prison pipeline is real. I see it here on the peninsula. What else needs to happen to get a mass change in consciousness or compassion to make that happen, to make it stop happening, in schools, to stop the pipeline in schools and how we treat young people so harshly, and then they wind up in prison. So do you address that?
Can I make a suggestion?
Please.
Why don't we get the...
Let's get all the questions, and then we'll have one collective response.
Okay, thank y'all. I can be really concise. My question is going back to the definition of nonviolent versus violent. I think one of the things that we see in this era of reform is a response that we need to still craft exceptions. And I think one of my concerns about like exceptions from reform, and one of my concerns is how we trust the system to not craft exceptions in a way that's based on race and class. So I was wondering if I could just hear a response from both sides on that. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you so much for this incredible dialogue and conversation. My question was about how you think we can bridge the gap between law enforcement and our communities and the people who are being incarcerated, because I think it's so crucial for the action to happen legislation-wise, and how we can do that and whose responsibility that is. Thank you.
Thanks to everybody on the panel. Professor Forman, Angela J. Davis, also a defender in D.C., head of the office at one time, arbitrary justice, prosecutorial discretion, not well understood. Now I think maybe I should have spent my time as a prosecutor instead of 20 years as a public defender, understanding the power that prosecutors have. And there's another new book out, I haven't read yours or this one, but takes the idea that maybe we have way too many prosecutors that we've hired, and as a result, it's not just mass incarceration as a result of the drug war on drugs, but the over-prosecution of cases and the lack of African-American prosecutors in the 3,000 counties that you've talked about. Can you address some of that, and maybe even Paul Butler's race-based jury nullification, how we can start to have at least a majority African-American jurors where the defendant is African-American, should they want that? Should the defendant want that?
Wow, so we'll throw it open. This is a lot, man. We had 4 people and about 7 questions, so throw it out there.
7 hard questions.
With the restorative justice, and it comes in various forms. I think James touches upon it. He didn't tell you the end. Well, you talked about the last scenario where he actually went to the victim. And I think the restorative justice concept you outlined very well in the idea that the apology letter, right, that humanizes the offender, that I made a mistake, I'm sorry. Usually a formal restorative justice program may have some other things attached to it, community service. If you took something from the store, you may go work in the store. But the key is, but I think restorative justice, that this is pre-entry into the criminal justice system, because we know with our youth, once they enter the criminal justice system or when they get suspended, the likelihood of incarceration grows exponentially. And so you want to prevent them from ever getting into the system. So you want a system where the police and the community can work together so that the officer in the field that has this case can say this young man should be, or this young lady should be a youth court. Now, the challenge is going to be, to the debate we had, is most programs are limited to nonviolent. And that's the challenge. It gets back into these categories, which I think is, if everyone on the panel is agreeing, is we got to have that discussion so that there's a level of comfort of what the levels mean and how to do this. With the police and community relations, I think you saw a part of it. One of the biggest challenges that I see from a policing point of view as a cop is the inability to have a discussion in which all sides are viewed. So the police have to be quiet for a moment, and we have to listen to you and understand exactly what you're saying, understand the history, understand the consequences, and not just make it just some simplistic law and order type of thing. In return, the community's got to understand the nuances from being a cop, the concerns that I may have for my own safety, the violence, the things that I'm seeing, and the stress that I may be under of seeing people at their worst. Small amount of people, but they're always at their worst. If we can find that common ground and understand and have empathy for each other with the understanding, always with the one foundational part, the police work for you. That's the part that you never lose touch of. But I think we got to start that communication. I think the professor said it best, is that means a lot of uncomfortable discussions. But the challenge is where to have them, how to have them, without being accusatory. If you go inside of a room and start talking about race, you may lose them in 2 minutes. If you go in there and start talking about implicit bias, the work that Jennifer Eberhard is doing, and you start talking about human behavior, I kept using that word, human behavior, that you're telling a cop that he or she may be making these mistakes because they're human, not because they're suspect, not because they're nefarious, not because they're evil, but because they're human, you have captured me. Now, we know in any group there's always going to be a small amount of knuckleheads that need to be fired, should be imprisoned. I'm talking about cops, like any other profession. But the vast majority want to do the right job. We're just not allowing them to do it. And we have to take responsibility for that. And so I think that's important, then we can have the discussions on how to make our community safe. Right now, they're like two different polar opposite discussions. And people say, and the community has to start realizing that on one sense, it's saying they don't want the police. On the other sense, the greatest call for stop and frisk and hotspot policing in my city came from James' whole book, from the minority community itself. But I accept that that's because they've been convinced that's the only way I can help them. And so I can push back on that and provide other alternatives that are just as effective. So I'm going to close my comments with, I leave here very optimistic. Even the disagreements, there's consensus on what that means and where we need to go and the kind of discussions we're supposed to have. And I applaud James and the panelists, but especially James for writing the book, because it was educational for me, and I've been in this game for 30 plus years, to see why I think what I thought back in the 90s until how I evolved right now to this generation. It's going to help put me forward to what I need to fight for and open my eyes to other things. And I hope it does it for you. And that we can agree, sometimes we can disagree, but in the words of Dr. King, as long as we don't have to be disagreeable, and that we can actually come with solutions. So that question about police and community relations, start with just getting to know your police department. And I think getting to know and making them respond to you and engage with you and learn what they have, what they don't have. Do you even know what policies they have? Do you know what their policy is on racial profiling or what it is on stops? But I think there's so much we can do together that I still leave here very optimistic.
We all going to respond?
You can respond,
Okay,
yeah, and
okay.
then we are convening. I hear books calling everyone's name.
I'll be
actually
very,
outside, so.
I'll be very, very brief. There's a lot to say about all these questions, but just on the question of empathy and how to achieve it and how to actually kind of lead to the kind of shifts we're talking about. One of the strengths of the book and why it's so readable and even though it's a difficult subject, but it's truly enjoyable to read for such a difficult and heavy subject, because James does an absolutely brilliant job of weaving in these individual stories of people who have been impacted by the criminal justice system and bringing them out to these larger historical and structural developments. And I think as a historian, what we see is, nobody ever thought in 1859 that it would be possible to abolish slavery. It was something that seemed, it was just like a part of American life. And part of what led to the change is actually getting slave narratives out to the general public, putting enslaved people, giving enslaved people platforms to galvanize support in the northern states. And so I think with this case, we're such a divided and segregated society that, and there has been a lot of shame about people who were incarcerated and what that means. Once we can contextualize these stories, once people who've been incarcerated their voices, their experiences get out there, I think that begins to plant more and more seeds of possible change, and people become humanized. Even the most violent offender, we've been talking about that a lot, their story, the context that led them to rob somebody at gunpoint or kill somebody or kill 5 people as part of their membership in the informal economy, those things begin to change, and we realize, oh, well, maybe they don't deserve to be punished. Maybe they don't deserve to experience the conditions in prison that they are.
Wow, that's hard to follow. That was beautifully said. Following up on Elizabeth's point about the power of story, I think that the book's ability to tell stories, including James' own story, and one thing that I was really struck by in his opening remarks is he was talking about the importance of teaching a class in prison and having 10 students that were from prison and 10 students that were from his university. And I think that some of the most catalytic points in history for mobilizing people is when you bring together people who normally don't have contact with each other. It was true in the civil rights movement, that relationship between students coming down and going to the South and the cross-fertilization between, people who understood their communities intimately and had been fighting segregation for generations. But it was that coming together in the Black Power and Black Studies movement. At San Francisco State, the San Francisco State Rebellion started with a tutoring program that took place in Hunters Point. And I think that, it's very important to privilege the role of the incarcerated and the formerly incarcerated in our current movement. There are so many challenges given how people are made invisible. Part of prison is to make people invisible and then to, in some ways, be given the power to represent them. So deconstructing not only the way they've been spoken about, but that power of story. And that's something that I really enjoyed in the book. And I think figuring out ways to fight for structural change and all of the lenses we've talked about, alternate lenses to punishment, informal economy, everyone has to work. The question is, what happens when you're excluded from the legal economy? Public health, drug problems as viewed from the lens of addiction, viewed from the point, and very importantly, so-called gun crime viewed from the lens of public health. So I guess those two things, thinking about alternate ways that we interpret this, and then, really making sure that we privilege, just as we did in the civil rights movement, it's very important to privilege the people themselves. I think the profound class base and that race and class are inseparable. We even see in the book how essentially, particularly in the case of the police, how they sometimes manifest, even Black police manifest racial attitudes towards poor and working class people that they see. So I think figuring out ways to break down some of those social barriers and to make sure that we figure out questions of redistribution, whether it's education and resources, about how to reach the populations that are most affected.
So I'm not going to be able to answer all 4 of those questions, but I am going to be outside in a few minutes, and if I didn't answer your question, come talk to me there while I'm, signing. I want to say that one of my goals with this event, this is a book that's about the complexity and diversity of opinion within the African American community and generations of African American activists and intellectuals and politicians having conversations about the issues of crime and punishment. And then we've replicated that on this stage today, which has been very exciting for me. I will answer one question, which is about prosecutors and public defenders, or at least I'll answer the public defender part. I was on a panel a couple weeks ago in Baltimore, and there's a federal judge, Ronald Davis, who commented on the book. And one of the things that he said nice about the book is he said, I really liked how you were fair to everybody, but you criticized everybody. And when he said that, I realized that wasn't entirely true. There's one group of people that get no criticism in this book. There's one group of people who are the heroes in this book, and that is public defenders. So this is a love letter to a public defender.
So this has been a wonderful experience. I want to just thank all of you for helping to make this happen. And I can say the same thing about the panel that I can say about the book. About the panel, a lot of your ideas that we've heard today will remain with me after we leave here. And I think that's also true about the book, is that the many stories that you tell in the book, Sandra Dozier and Brandon, and I mean, these are stories that actually remain with you, characters that remain with you, and that you continue to think about long after you close the cover. So thank you for giving us that gift about this very important social problem.
Thank you.